Nearly half a decade ago, I had this idea that it'd be really cool to learn how to make video games, and so I began to embark on the ambitious journey to make the next Halo, the next Minecraft, the next big indie game. As you can probably tell, that was a little bit too ambitious, but as the years passed, that small passion project grew into something a little bigger. If you've seen any of my videos, things may have seemed like they were progressing smoothly, but behind the scenes, things weren't working out too well. For starters, the game was just completely cooked. For some reason, while developing a first-person shooter, I hadn't focused on combat, and the enemies that did exist were complete trash. I mean, for God's sake, after 2 years in development, there wasn't a single playable level. All these problems began to catch up to me, and a few months ago, with the pressure of final term exams, I felt the need to take a step back and reset my focus on school. But, as it turns out, I can't stay away from game development for long. One late night, while studying at my desk, I had a sudden wave of that midnight motivation and decided that it was about time we set the game back on track. Welcome to Devlog 12. Before I talk about all the new features I've developed, I want to give a little context behind the last year of development. Nearly a year ago, I realized I needed to turn the project into an actual video game. Within 2 months, I created the player's ship and the industrial district, while implementing many different interactions. A few months after that, I'd graphically overhauled both the levels I'd previously made, while revamping all the systems in place, such as weapon equipping, selecting missions, shopping, exchanging loot, and much more. So, after months of effort, I'd successfully brought the game loop to a functional standard. But sadly, that's just about where my luck ended. My next task involved focusing on gameplay, and I did so by trying to create enemies. But to be honest, creating enemies has been the kryptonite to my development. Before this point, I'd attempted to create enemies 3 or 4 times, and every single time, I fell short. Every variation of enemies had gotten better, but they continued to feel cheap, dumb, and boring to fight. So, I decided to lock in and create a lineup of enemies that would be smarter, more efficient, better looking, fun to fight, and I kind of did none of those. We'll talk about why later, but after a month of development, the new enemies were just as bad as before. And that's where everything kind of fell apart. It felt like the game had no future, considering that I couldn't get combat to feel good. Combat that was meant to be the center of my game. So, as you already know, I took a step back and returned a few weeks later, determined to set the project back on track. My game's been missing combat, and adding it is a matter of 2 things. Combat in my game requires satisfying gunplay and fun enemies. We'll start with the gunplay, and my goal was pretty simple. I want the guns to not only be satisfying, I want them to be addictive. In order to test gunplay, I made a little room and put some cubes inside, which acted as enemies for the time being. When it came to making the gun satisfying, I started simple, by completely overhauling weapon hit markers. Originally, they were just 4 stationary rectangles that would pop up every time you hit an enemy. I felt like it wasn't satisfying enough, and so I swapped it out for these animated hit markers. They're super satisfying, especially when you can chain several shots together. I also implemented a separate indicator when you actually kill enemies, making the final blow that much more satisfying. After setting that up, I decided to take a quick look at destruction. Many games use bullet marks to give guns a sense of impact, but bullets that actually destroy the environment are always more immersive. I mean, just look at this crudgy gameplay from the finals. Considering that I was using cubes and spheres in the test scene, I decided to use them to test out destruction. I broke them up into a bunch of pieces, and then using the enemy health system, I replaced the normal mesh with the destroyed version, resulting in very satisfying destruction. With the destruction, I felt like I needed to add some effects, and so I set up an explosion particle system, which really brought the destruction together. This new explosion effect was also a massive improvement over the old one I was using. As soon as I got the destruction working, I moved on to loot. I know we're not even talking about gunplay anymore, but I'm just gonna move on here because I'm so happy with what I managed to achieve. Back when I was working on the game loop, I also implemented a loot and currency system when working on the in-game shop. Although I got the functionality down, I didn't really know how to make it look good. Basic colors didn't really give the loot a feeling of value, and just using an emissive material was way too bright. After playing around a little, I found out that using a Fresnel shader with a solid material on the inside really achieved that effect I was going for. And by using this technique, I made several loot variations with different shapes and colors. I also added a little sound when you pick them up to bring the effect to life. So after all these little improvements, Gunplay is feeling really good, and sometimes I just hop in to have some fun shooting around. Now it's time to tackle the biggest obstacle: enemies. I've gone through the process of creating enemies, not liking them, deleting them, and restarting so many times, and I really want to get them right this time around. The old enemies lacked fun gameplay, good pathfinding, didn't communicate with the enemies around them, and just weren't fun to fight. Instead of focusing on making combat fun, I had focused on loading enemies with up to 10 attacks and behavioral stages, and I had to learn the hard way that more features doesn't mean better. None of the enemies had clear characteristics and just felt like copies of each other. So let's fix that. My biggest problem was biting off more than I could chew. And so instead of tackling the creation of many enemies at once, I decided to focus on one enemy at a time. I started with the turrets, and even though these are the easiest enemies to make, they took me a couple of days to finish. I began by spending some time improving the art style for the enemies. I've previously had this feeling that the enemies looked flat and out of place. I originally tried to change this by adding an emissive material to the enemies, but I was lazy and didn't want to properly map the material, so it left enemies looking bright, undetailed, and just didn't work. This time around, I wasn't going to cut any corners and properly set up the art for the enemies. I discovered that by using ProBuilder, which is a Unity add-on, you can individually change the material associated with faces on a mesh, and I used this to create the new art style. And by the way, let me know how you feel about this art direction, and if there's anything you'd like to see. With an art style that I liked, I began to focus on functionality. The first two turrets I made were variations of a typical turret, with basic effects, strafe cancelling, and whatever else to bring the experience together. Instead of a muzzle flash, I used this pulse effect, and I really like how it feels during combat. The actual bullet projectile also received slight improvements to help with collisions and damage, as well as helping it fit in with the new art style. On top of those first two turrets, I made two more turrets that are smaller and will be placed around maps on the floor or attached to the ceiling. Now all of that is cool, and even though these turrets are completely different in their form factor, rate of fire, reload time, and range, they all use the same projectile. So I decided to revisit an old projectile of mine, the missile. My old missile was super unoptimized, didn't have collisions, and I really think that its movement could have used a lot of improvement. Despite all of this, it was still super fun to fight against, and so I had to bring it back. I changed the randomized movement to operate based on sine and cosine waves, with randomized x and y factors. I also set up explosions and collisions, and after that, I thought the missiles really came together. After setting up the missile projectile, I took the old missile turret and set it up so that the missiles visually spawned into the launcher before getting fired. This provides a visual indicator and also looks pretty cool. After the turrets, I turned my attention to what I guess would be the first actual enemy, being the tank. I've always loved this enemy from the model to its attacks, and this time I really wanted to do it justice. I started by implementing the new art style, and then set up all the attacks using the new projectiles and missiles. For the missiles, I had these launchers animate outwards from the sides, load missiles, and then fire them, which I just feel is super satisfying. I also reworked the spinning laser attack so that it wouldn't get blocked by parts of the tank, and also re-added the deployable drone that will spawn once the tank reaches low health. After all of that, I really think the tank has come together. After the tank, I thought it would make sense to set up the bombardier, which is basically the heavy version of a drone, with a lot of health and high damage attacks. I did everything I've done with previous enemies by updating the art and setting up bullets and missiles, but this time I decided to spice things up a little bit. To start, I gave the bombardier a deployable laser that spins upon hitting the ground, and only stops once the player shoots it down. In addition, I found myself reworking the grenades as they were weirdly inconsistent, and I just hated how the old grenades looked. After the bombardier, which is a large drone, I thought it made sense to move on to a small drone. I absolutely love the model for this enemy, and despite being simple, I love the final result. The small drone only shoots bullets and missiles, and after adding a nice little animation, this enemy was quickly done. After the drone, I set up the Seeker, which is basically like a creeper from Minecraft. I didn't change much besides updating the art style and the explosion. Now, remember that tank I showed off a couple minutes ago? Well, I loved it so much that I made a smaller version. In terms of pathfinding, this mini tank is much more aggressive, preferring to stay closer to the player, but it also comes with much less health. I also hooked this enemy up with ignition mines, which it throws at the player. These mines ignite the area around them, damaging the player if you get too close. To be honest, after days of developing complex enemies with unique behavioral stages, pathfinding, and attacks, I decided to make something a little simpler. I created this laser trap which pops out of the ground and spins while the player is within its range. I started with a basic opening and closing animation, and then set up a health system so that the player could destroy the laser. Now, these last two enemies were by far the most difficult to create. Some urge inside of me really wants to create humanoid enemies, and despite the fact that I struggle with creating humanoid models, I still gave it a shot. Lucky enough, I actually attempted to create these enemies before, and even though they had broken animations, buggy attacks, and messed up models, I was able to use them as reference to create the new and updated humanoid models that also fit the new art style. I'm really bad with humanoid designs, but I really think I nailed the look, design, and proportions for these enemies. After getting the general model down, I gave them pretty typical attacks, such as bullets, missiles, grenades, and lasers. By the way, I think this laser attack is pretty sick. So, after about 3 weeks of just constant development, I finally created gameplay that I think is pretty satisfying, and I'm really starting to see a vision for the game. However, there's still one more aspect to gameplay, which is level design. I originally wanted to show off some really cool progress I've made in terms of the layout of levels, the artistic direction of the project, and the types of levels I plan to make. But I haven't been able to make as much progress as I want to, so I'll be talking about all of that in the next video. Regardless, if you enjoyed this one and would like to follow the development of this game, feel free to like and subscribe, and with that said, I'll see you in the next one.